Robert was 61 years old. Every weekday morning, he woke up at 5:45. He poured the same cup of coffee, drove the same 40 minutes to work, parked in the same parking space, and sat at the same desk he'd been sitting at for almost 20 years. From the outside, everything looked perfectly normal. His retirement accounts were healthy. His house was nearly paid off. His children were financially independent. He wasn't buried in debt. In fact, most people would have looked at Robert's life and said, "You're almost there." But every Sunday evening, he felt something he couldn't explain. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't boredom. It was the quiet feeling that, maybe, he didn't actually need to keep doing this. One evening, while eating dinner, his wife looked at him and asked a simple question. "Robert, if money isn't the reason you're still working, then what is?" He didn't answer, because for the first time, he realized he didn't actually know. A few days later, during lunch, one of his co-workers announced he was retiring. He was younger than Robert, not richer, not luckier, just leaving. Robert couldn't stop thinking about it. How can he retire? And I can't? That single question sent Robert down a path that completely changed the way he looked at retirement. And what he discovered shocked him. Because it wasn't his retirement savings that were keeping him at work. It was one assumption that millions of hard-working Americans make every single year. An assumption that quietly steals years of freedom without most people ever realizing it. Today, I want to tell you Robert's story because somewhere along the way, it might start feeling a lot like your own. And before this video ends, you'll know whether you're still working because you truly need to, or simply because no one has ever shown you another option. Robert couldn't stop thinking about the conversation he had with his co-worker. They had worked in the same building for almost 12 years. Same department, similar salary, similar retirement savings. Yet one of them was walking away, and the other couldn't imagine doing it. That evening, Robert opened his laptop, not to watch the news, not to check the stock market, but to answer one simple question. Why am I still working? He expected the answer to be money. Instead, every answer he wrote down led to one thing: health insurance. What if something happened before Medicare? What if one hospital stay wiped out years of savings? What if retiring too early turned out to be the biggest financial mistake of his life? The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that working until 65 wasn't really a choice. It was simply what responsible people did. Or at least, that's what he believed. A few days later, while having coffee with an old friend named David, Robert mentioned his plan. 3 more years, he said, then I'll finally retire. David smiled. 3 more years because you want to, or 3 more years because you're afraid? Robert laughed. Honestly, both. David nodded. Then he asked a question Robert had never considered. Have you ever actually calculated what retiring before 65 would cost? Or are you only calculating what it might cost? Robert stared at him because the truth was, he had never run the numbers. He had simply accepted what everyone around him believed, that retiring before Medicare was dangerous, that healthcare would be unaffordable, that waiting until 65 was the only sensible option. But what if those weren't facts? What if they were just assumptions? That single conversation changed everything, because over the next few weeks, Robert discovered that many Americans don't delay retirement because they have to. They delay it because no one ever showed them how to plan for the years before Medicare. And once he understood that, the future he had imagined for decades started to look completely different. The following Saturday, Robert sat at his kitchen table with a notebook, a calculator, and a simple goal. He wanted proof, not opinions, not advice from co-workers, not headlines from the internet, just facts. He started writing down everything he believed about retiring before 65. At the top of the page, he wrote, "I can't retire because of health insurance." It was a sentence he'd repeated for years, almost automatically, but then he stopped and asked himself something he'd never asked before. How much would health insurance actually cost me? Not what he'd heard, not what someone told him, the real number. That question changed everything, because for the first time, Robert realized he had built his retirement plan around an assumption, not around actual calculations. And he isn't alone. Every year, thousands of hard-working Americans continue working, not because they don't have enough money, but because they've never taken the time to measure the cost of leaving. Fear has a strange way of doing that. When we don't know the numbers, our imagination usually makes them much bigger than reality. Now, that doesn't mean healthcare before 65 is inexpensive. It isn't. And it certainly doesn't mean everyone should retire early. They shouldn't. Every family's situation is different. But here's what surprised Robert the most. There was a huge difference between saying healthcare will be expensive and actually understanding exactly how expensive it might be and what options were available. That difference was the beginning of confidence, because retirement planning isn't about eliminating every expense. It's about replacing uncertainty with understanding. Robert closed his notebook, looked out the kitchen window, and quietly said something he hadn't said in years. Maybe I've been asking the wrong question. Instead of asking, can I afford to retire before 65? Maybe he should have been asking, do I actually understand my options? And once he asked the right question, the answers started appearing. The following Monday, Robert did something he should have done years earlier. Instead of asking friends, instead of scrolling through social media, he sat down with someone who helped people plan retirement every day. He wasn't looking for permission to retire. He was looking for clarity. Before the meeting even started, Robert said something that surprised the advisor. "I'm pretty sure I already know the answer. I have to work until 65. The advisor smiled. "Maybe, but let's make sure that's a fact, and not just a habit." Those words stayed with Robert, because habits can quietly become beliefs, and beliefs can quietly become life decisions. The advisor pulled out a blank sheet of paper, not a complicated software program, not pages full of charts, just one simple page. Across the top, he wrote 3 questions. How much do you spend every month? How much guaranteed income will you have? And what happens if you stop working next year instead of 3 years from now? Robert realized no one had ever asked him those questions. Everyone had talked about retirement. Nobody had talked about his retirement. For the next hour, they didn't discuss the stock market. They didn't try to predict interest rates. They simply looked at Robert's life, his savings, his expenses, his health, his goals, and something unexpected happened. The number Robert feared the most wasn't nearly as frightening once it was written on paper, because uncertainty is usually much scarier than reality. The advisor explained that many Americans automatically assume they'll pay the highest possible healthcare costs before Medicare. But healthcare expenses aren't the same for everyone. They depend on things like household income, where you live, the type of coverage you choose, and how your retirement income is structured. In other words, there isn't one answer. There's a plan. Robert leaned back in his chair. For years, he thought the biggest question was, can I afford to retire? Now, he realized the better question was, have I actually built a retirement plan? Or have I just been hoping everything works out? That difference changes everything, because retirement isn't just about saving enough money. It's about knowing how to use it, and that was the lesson Robert had been missing all along. But there was still one problem. Even if he retired early, how would he replace the paycheck that had arrived every 2 weeks for nearly 40 years. That's where the real planning began. Robert drove home that afternoon in complete silence. Not because he was worried, but because his mind was trying to process something he had never considered before. For nearly 40 years, life had followed the same pattern. Work, get paid, pay the bills, repeat. Every decision, every vacation, every purchase was built around one thing, his paycheck. Without that paycheck, he couldn't imagine life working any other way. A few days later, he met the advisor again. This time, the advisor didn't open a spreadsheet. He simply asked, "Robert, where does your paycheck come from today?" Robert smiled. "My employer." The advisor nodded. "Exactly. Now tell me, where will your paycheck come from after you retire?" Robert paused. He had never thought about retirement that way. The advisor leaned forward. "Most people believe retirement means their paycheck disappears. That's not what happens. The paycheck changes employers." Robert looked confused. The advisor continued, "Today, your employer pays you. Tomorrow, your savings, Social Security, investments, and other retirement income sources become your new employer. You're still receiving income. You're just receiving it from different places." That idea completely changed the way Robert looked at retirement. Because, suddenly, retirement wasn't about replacing one giant paycheck. It was about building several smaller income streams that worked together. The advisor grabbed a blank sheet of paper. He drew 4 simple circles. One represented Social Security. One represented retirement savings. One represented personal savings. And one represented investment income. Very few retirees depend on only one of these. Most successful retirees combine them. Robert stared at the page. For years, he believed retirement was one enormous financial decision. Now, he realized it was actually dozens of smaller decisions working together. That's why 2 people with exactly the same retirement savings can experience completely different retirements. One runs out of confidence long before running out of money. The other sleeps peacefully every night, not because they saved more, but because they understood how their income would actually work. Robert finally understood something that had been missing all along. Money alone doesn't create confidence. A plan does. And once that plan started coming together, one final question remained. If he retired earlier, would he actually lose money? Or had waiting all these years been costing him something far more valuable? A week later, Robert wasn't thinking about healthcare anymore. He wasn't thinking about taxes. He wasn't even thinking about money. He was thinking about time. That Saturday morning, he found an old photo album in the basement. Inside were pictures from family vacations, camping trips, little league games, birthdays, and a photograph of himself at 35, standing on top of a mountain with his 2 young sons. He smiled. Then he noticed something. Back then, climbing that mountain had felt easy. Today, just carrying the storage box upstairs had left him out of breath. It wasn't a painful realization. It was simply an honest one. Time had quietly done what time always does. It had changed him. That evening, Robert asked his wife something completely unexpected. "If I work 3 more years, what are we actually gaining?" She thought for a moment. Then she quietly replied, "Maybe money, but what are we giving up?" Neither of them spoke for several seconds, because deep down they both knew the answer. More mornings together, more road trips, more holidays without asking for vacation approval, more afternoons with future grandchildren, more healthy years. That's when Robert understood something that no retirement calculator had ever shown him. Delaying retirement doesn't just have a financial cost. Sometimes it has a life cost. Now, That doesn't mean everyone should retire as early as possible. Absolutely not. Some people genuinely need more income. Others simply enjoy their work. And there's nothing wrong with that. But working longer should be a decision you make, not a decision fear makes for you. Robert realized he had spent years preparing financially for retirement, while never preparing emotionally for it. He had planned for his money, but he had never planned for his life. That's a mistake more people make than they realize. We spend decades learning how to build a career. Very few of us ever learn how to leave one. As Robert closed the photo album, he whispered something to himself. Maybe I've been protecting my retirement savings, while forgetting to protect the years those savings were supposed to buy. And that sentence changed the way he looked at every decision that followed, because retirement was no longer about escaping work. It was about making sure the healthiest years he had left weren't spent waiting for a date on the calendar. But there was still one final question. Was Robert actually ready, or was he simply excited? There was only one way to find out. The next morning, Robert made himself another cup of coffee. But this time, he wasn't searching for another opinion. He wasn't watching another retirement video. He wasn't asking another coworker what they would do. He decided, if this was one of the biggest decisions of his life, he wanted to make it based on facts, not fear. So he opened a blank notebook. At the top of the first page, he wrote 3 simple words. My retirement plan, not someone else's. His. Instead of asking, can I retire? He asked, what would need to be true for retirement to actually work? That small change changed everything. The first thing he did was calculate what life actually cost. Not what he guessed, not what he remembered, what he actually spent, month after month. Some expenses surprised him. Others were much lower than he expected. For the first time, retirement became a math problem instead of an emotional one. Next, he listed every source of future income: Social Security, retirement savings, personal savings, investments, even the possibility of occasional consulting work. Suddenly, he wasn't looking at one giant pile of money. He was looking at a complete income plan. Then came the question. That mattered more than all the others. What if I stopped working next year? Instead of waiting 3 more years? Instead of imagining the answer, he calculated it. The difference wasn't nearly as dramatic as he had feared. In fact, what surprised him wasn't the money. It was how much confidence replaced uncertainty. Once the numbers were written down, that's something many people never experience. They spend years planning to retire without ever building an actual retirement plan. Hope is not a strategy. Assumptions are not a strategy. Confidence comes from understanding your own numbers, your own expenses, your own goals. Because retirement isn't about copying your neighbor. It's about creating a plan that fits your life. Robert finally understood. The question had never been, can I afford to retire? The real question was, do I finally understand my financial life well enough to make this decision with confidence? And for the first time, his answer wasn't, I hope so. It was, I think I finally do. But before Robert made his final decision, there was one more conversation, the one that mattered most, the conversation with himself. The following weekend, Robert and his wife drove to the small lake where they used to spend Sunday afternoons years ago. They hadn't been there in almost 5 years. Life had simply become too busy. They sat on a wooden bench, watching families walk by. Children laughed. Couples held hands. An older man slowly taught his grandson how to fish. Robert smiled. Then his wife quietly asked, if you woke up tomorrow and money was no longer the reason, would you still go back to work on Monday? Robert didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched the grandfather laughing with his grandson. Then he looked down at his hands. hands that had spent nearly 40 years building a career, providing for his family, solving other people's problems, and suddenly he realized something. For decades, he had measured success by promotions, raises, and retirement account balances. But perhaps the next chapter of life should be measured differently. More mornings without an alarm clock, more dinners that weren't rushed, more birthdays that weren't interrupted by work, more time with the people he had spent his entire career trying to provide for. Robert finally turned to his wife and smiled. "I don't think I've been afraid of retirement. I think I've been afraid of change." She reached over, took his hand, and quietly replied, "Change isn't the end of the life you've built. It's the beginning of enjoying it." That afternoon, Robert didn't make the decision to retire. He made something even more important. He made the decision to stop letting fear make the decision for him. Whether he retired next year or 2 years later, it would finally be his decision. Not a date on the calendar, not a rumor from a coworker, not an assumption he'd believed for years. His. And sometimes, that's the moment retirement truly begins. Robert's story isn't unique. In fact, that's exactly why I wanted to share it with you. Because somewhere across America, thousands of people are waking up tomorrow morning, pouring the same cup of coffee, driving the same road to work, quietly wondering, do I really need to keep doing this? Some of them do. Some of them don't. The difference isn't always money. More often, it's information. Retirement has changed. Healthcare has changed. Tax laws have changed. Social security has changed. The decisions your parents made may not be the right decisions for you. That's why the most successful retirees don't simply save more money. They understand their options. They ask better questions. They build a plan around their life, instead of someone else's expectations. Maybe you'll decide to work until 65. Maybe you'll retire before that. Maybe you'll continue working because you truly love what you do. Every one of those decisions can be the right one, as long as it's your decision, not fears, not confusions, and not because of an assumption that was never tested. I want to leave you with one thought. A successful retirement isn't the reward for working the longest. It's the reward for making informed decisions at the right time. If Robert's story teaches us anything, it's this. Before you add another year to your career, make sure you aren't subtracting one from the life you've spent decades working to enjoy. That single question might change your future, just like it changed his. Before we go, I'd like to ask you one simple question. If someone had explained all of this to you 5 years ago, would you have made the same retirement decisions you've made so far? Or would you have done something differently? Sometimes, the most valuable financial decision you'll ever make isn't buying the perfect investment. It isn't timing the stock market. And it isn't finding one magical retirement strategy. Sometimes, it's simply understanding the choices you already have. Because confidence doesn't come from having all the answers. It comes from asking the right questions before making life-changing decisions. If Robert's story reminded you of yourself or someone you love, I hope it encourages one conversation, one calculation, or one question that you've been putting off for far too long, because retirement isn't the finish line. It's the beginning of the life you've spent decades working to create. If you found this video helpful, I'd truly appreciate it if you subscribed. Every week, we explore one retirement question, one real-life story, and one practical strategy to help everyday Americans make retirement decisions with more confidence and less uncertainty. And before you leave, I'd love to hear from you. If you were in Robert's position, Would you retire before 65? Or would you keep working? Tell me why in the comments. I read every single one, and many of your questions inspire future videos. Until next time, take care of your health. Take care of the people who matter most. And above all, never let fear make a retirement decision. That knowledge can make for you. Thank you for spending these moments with me. I'll see you in the next one.